Today we're going to talk about water quality. We'll talk first about the sources of water quality, then some of the effects, and then finally what we can do to help our water quality. So I wanted to talk first about sources of water pollution. Water pollution is any introduction of an element that is harmful to the organisms that depend on the water. So human-caused water pollution really comes from two main sources, or two main causes. One being industrial sources, so industrialization has caused some water pollution issues, and then two is rapid human population growth. So you could argue that the trash that you see here is because we have more people living in an area than good places to put garbage, or just too much garbage created to begin with. But all pollution we can either classify as point source or non-point source pollution. So point source means we can actually point to a source of the pollution. You can target it back to a single source, such as this pipe that's here. Maybe there's a leaking oil tanker. You can see that. You can point to the source. There is the problem. Maybe a mine that's been abandoned, or a storage tank that's leaking. When you find the source, that's a point source pollutant. Non-point source is just kind of a cumulative effect. It's more distributed. It's kind of just everywhere. It's hard to point to the source. It's also very difficult to regulate and control. So, for instance, herbicides and fertilizers from people's yards. Well, which person in the city are you going to point to, because they're all doing it? Or boats that ride along the lake and they all leak a little bit of oil or gasoline from their engines. You know, which boat is going to be in trouble? It's just kind of a cumulative effect from something that's been dispersed throughout the area. No matter whether it's point or non-point, we can classify our sources and our types of pollutants into this nifty little table here. Pathogens are living things that spread diseases. Organic matter, think like animal waste. Organic chemicals like pesticides and fertilizers. Inorganic chemicals like salt, up north where they put salt on the road to keep it from icing. That can be a water pollutant. Heavy metals like lead and mercury get into our water system occasionally, and then physical agents being like heat or sediment that runs off, those can cause problems as well. In our ecosystems, water pollution has a big effect and can have a bigger effect the higher you go up your food chain. In your food chain, let's say on the very bottom level, your primary consumers, the first little bitty things that eat the plants, ingest a little bit of pollution. Then the things that come along and eat them eat a lot of that type of animal, and so it builds up in their system. They have more pollution the further you go at that trophic level. That's a process called biomagnification. It's important, or it's especially concerning when you have persistent organic pollutants, or what we call POPs. These don't break down because they're synthetic. Your natural decomposers like bacteria don't know what to do with them, so they can't break down very easily. They're also soluble in fats, so they are stored in the tissues of the animal that has eaten it and is passed on to the next animal that eats it, and it stays in the system, and it can be distributed over a long area. DDT was one of your famous persistent pollutants back in the 60s, 70s. They caused eggshell thinning in the birds of prey, such as bald eagles, because the birds of prey, the bald eagles, were eating the fish, which had DDT in their system, and it was biomagnifying. In humans, we don't lay eggs, so we have trouble with reproductive systems, with our nervous systems, with circulatory systems. They can cause problems for us as well. Now, every organism is going to be affected a little bit differently. We all have what's called a range of tolerance. And a range of tolerance for a certain organism is how much of a disruption they can stand before not being able to function properly. So organisms try to maintain what we call homeostasis. It's living their best life, right? If you get beyond that range of tolerance, then they have trouble with physiological stress on their bodies. They can't grow properly, they can't reproduce properly, and in extreme cases they could even die of the pollutant. One interesting pollutant is an endocrine, well actually a whole series of pollutants are classified as endocrine disruptors. The endocrine system is that collection of glands that produce hormones that regulate our body's behaviors, so growth, development, reproductive function, sleep, mood, and endocrine disruptors can disrupt that system. So there's several that we can put in that classification, that system there that you see in our chart over there. A couple of areas that we have specific concerns about. One is the coral reef system. The coral reefs are very susceptible to changes, are very sensitive to their environment. So any changes in temperature or the amount of sediment from runoff, that sediment can block sunlight and prevent producers from producing the food that they need. Destructive fishing practices, all of this could result in the death of the coral reef system or the animals that inhabit it. Wetlands and forests, mangrove forests, are also of concern to us. They are kind of our first line of defense along the coast. That's where the water covers the area either part of the day in such like a tidal wetland or all of the day. And they're very useful to us because they provide purification of water, flood protection, they can be a nursery for our animals, and they're very susceptible to commercial development, to pollutants that we put in our water that are covering them part of the time, and of course overfishing and too much sediment. There's also some events that we are concerned about, one being oil spills. Oil spills, not only like you see on the surface here, they can coat the feathers and fur of animals, but also subsurface. Some parts of petroleum, that's crude oil, some of it sinks and can kill bottom dwelling organisms as well. And then some of it's going to make its way to shore and wash up. And so you have the oil, the petroleum affecting the living animals and the ecosystem there on the coast. And also you have an economic consequence of tourism and fishing not being good during that time. So oil spills are definitely a concern. Two of the biggest ones that you want to be able to pull out if needing to talk about oil spills, the most famous I guess you'd say, are Exxon Valdez in 1989. And then in 2010, what you guys might remember is the Deepwater Horizon in the Gulf of Mexico. They're mostly notable for the amount of oil that is spilled, and of course, being kind of United States centric, they're most notable to us because they happen off of our shores. But it's important to remember that oil spills, even though they make the news and they're huge and they're, have all these terrible pictures that make the news, that's not where most of the oil and the oil pollution in the oceans comes from. Most of it actually comes from non-point source, from runoff from our highways and land. It's almost 10 times the amount that you get from an oil tanker. They just happen to be concentrated in one area. So pollution in the ocean actually does mostly come from land activities running off. Here you have a picture of the Mississippi River Delta. And right along the coastline there, you have a current that's taking the water around the Gulf of Mexico going this way. So all of that sediment and all the pollution that's coming from the Mississippi River is dumped there and pulled across. And this is where you get that dead zone, that low oxygen level because of our process of eutrophication. Mississippi River runs through central United States where there's a lot of agriculture and farming, Kansas, Nebraska, Iowa, and a lot of fertilizers are used in those areas. So phosphorus and nitrogen, as well as any other sewer or whatnot that goes through that area, creates a big growth in algae. Then as the algae dies and decomposes, it uses up the dissolved oxygen and the water is depleted. So dissolved oxygen can create what we call hypoxic situations where you do not have enough oxygen because of the nutrients and the algae that's using the oxygen. And so you get kind of a fish kill, you get a dead zone where the fish and the animals don't live very well in that area. What we want is oligotrophic. Oligotrophic is where you have low amounts of nutrients, you do have some, so you get stable algae populations that's not all using up your oxygen at the same time, and so you get a high concentration of dissolved oxygen there. Litter is also a problem in our aquatic ecosystems. Besides being definitely ugly, it can get into the systems of animals that mistake it for food. And also when it breaks down, then those toxic substances like the PCBs and plastics can make their way into the food chain that way. So I saw this article this morning about a whale that had washed up and had 220 pounds of garbage in its stomach just from the process of trying to eat. Had ended up eating a bunch of garbage that was floating in the ocean. So a couple of factors that we don't think of because they're not chemicals, but they still count as pollutants. One is sediment. Sediment can cause a problem because it's blocking out the light. So your producers underneath, your aquatic plants, can't do photosynthesis as well. And also any animals that are trying to live in the waters that are very muddy and sediment filled either can't see predators coming or can't see the prey in order to eat. And then, of course, when the sediments eventually settle out, then you can disrupt the habitats that are living along the bottom. They're being covered by all that mud and sediment. Now, sediment runoff is natural, but we can definitely increase the amount of sediment from clearing land and not allowing the vegetation to hold that sediment in place, the soil in place. And then heat. Heat is another natural thing, but we can increase the amount of heat in an aquatic system by cooling water towers and power plants and other industrial systems, and then discharging that warm water into a nearby water source. Now, heat is a problem because hot water can't hold as much dissolved oxygen as cold water, and so no dissolved oxygen, or less dissolved oxygen, less aquatic organisms can live there. Groundwater is not exempt. There's definitely pollution that can get down into the groundwater, and the problem with groundwater pollution is that it's very hard to clean up. If an underground storage tank or if the heavy metals just migrate through the system into our aquifer, then it takes a very, very long time for water to migrate and infiltrate through the soil. Changes very slowly, so it's very, very hard to get to and to clean up, and so that pollution, that problem stays for a very, very long time. We can also get secondary pollutants. When elemental mercury, such as from burning coal in a coal burning power plant, whenever that elemental mercury enters an aquatic environment, bacteria in that aquatic ecosystem, they will convert it, they'll process it and convert it into a very highly toxic substance called methylmercury. So if you've gone fishing in East Texas, especially when you get down closer to the south, Beaumont, Port Arthur, you might have seen a couple of these signs around warning you not to eat the fish or to limit your consumption, because that mercury biomagnifies fish that have the mercury then are eaten by bigger fish, and then we eat the bigger fish, and then it can build up in your system and cause problems. So how can we clean up water pollution? Well, water pollution had frankly gotten out of hand through industrialization, and in the 1969, kind of the poster child of water quality debates and water quality awareness was the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland, Ohio. It was not the only polluted river, but it became notable because in 1969 it actually caught fire. There was so many toxic materials in the water, dissolved in the water, that the river was on fire. So I've included a video linked underneath this one. You can watch a very short clip about the Cuyahoga River. But this kind of was the poster child that spurred action towards taking care of our water sources. So in 1972 we passed the Clean Water Act that made a goal of cleaning water, surface water, enough for fishing and swimming by a goal, 1983, so in 10 years, to make the waters clear enough for fishing and swimming. And I would say largely they've done it pretty well. After Clean Water Act, we also had the Water Pollution Control Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act that protects our groundwater and surface water from pollution. And then you notice CERCLA down there again. We talked about CERCLA when we talked about mining. If there's a hazardous waste site, if there's a mine that's been left over, then CERCLA forces the owner of that project to clean it up. And if there's one that was abandoned prior to 1988, it set up funds to clean those up. And then we had Water Quality Act and Oceans Act that also are notable. So record your notable wins, and we are done with water.